Hello, class, and welcome to Lesson 4 on Mise en Scène. This is Lecture 1, in which we cover aspects of mise en scène. So, as always, let's start with the definition. What is mise en scène? Well, mise en scène, at a very simple level, is what appears in the frame. Staging the event for the camera. So, in our still here from The Devil Wears Prada, you have basically a stage, a sound stage, that's been constructed to look like an office, right? And you have your props in the form of mirrors, and pictures, and vases, and furniture. You have your actors, Anne Hathaway and Meryl Streep. You have their costumes, their hairstyles, their makeup. You have lighting in the scene. You have the composition, the way that everything's arranged, the way the actors are blocked. That's a theater term. So all of these things are staged for the camera. So mise en scène, as it may sound to some of you, is a French term. And it's originally from the theater, and it simply means put into the scene. And early cinema, such as A Trip to the Moon from 1903, directed by the French director Georges Méliès, was largely about mise en scène because cameras were not that sophisticated. They were too big to move. And editing as a craft had only barely begun to evolve. And so most of early cinema is a camera that's basically pointing at a stage. Now you can have a very creative stage like Méliès does in this film, but it was still basically a filmed play in many ways. And I will link the film A Trip to the Moon to this lesson so you can check it out if you want to see what I mean. So we talked about aspects of mise en scène, and we'll cover them in more detail as we go through here. We talked about the setting, which includes the location. That could be on a stage, as in the Devil Wears Prada photo, or it could be a live setting, right? Out in the world somewhere. And then props. Hermione here has got a prop in her hand, her wand, the human figure, which includes acting, costume, blocking, which is just where the actors stand and how they move, and makeup. All actors wear makeup on film, even if it doesn't seem like it, because it helps to highlight their features. I was on Jeopardy one time, a long time ago, like 15 years ago now, and one thing I did not expect was that they were going to put us in the makeup chair first, and so even I got makeup when I went on TV. Lighting, which is also a part of cinematography, but mainly it's a part of mise en scène, because the stage has to be lit before the cameras can shoot. And then composition. How are all these different elements composed? It's the same way that an artist would compose them on a canvas, right? Balance, contrast, the movement, and the depth. Because movies are three-dimensional, or at the very least, they give us the illusion of three dimensions. And so we have to compose for depth as well. And we'll get into that more when we cover cinematography. And here's another example from Parasite, Bong Joon-ho's Academy Award winning movie from a few years ago. And I put this in here just to show that mise en scène is very carefully composed in every scene, right? Not just the big vistas or, the fancy dance balls or the villain's lair in a Bond movie, right? Every frame is carefully composed to convey story, meaning, and emotion. And in this case, we have these characters who are poor, and what's being conveyed through the mise en scène here is that they live in a very cramped space, right? To the point where they have to literally hug the toilet while they're looking at their phones. They have all this sort of industrial stuff behind them. It's not comfortable. It doesn't look very clean. And again, it's very cramped. So The mise en scène, as much as the narrative or the dialogue, is doing your storytelling. And that's how I want you to think of mise en scène, as helping to tell the story. So some elements of mise en scène. We talked about the setting, right? Basically the background for the action. And it plays an active role in the narrative. Actors move around it in a three-dimensional way, and they make use of whatever's in the setting to help tell the story. Props, just an abbreviation for property. Again, plays an active role in the narrative, whether it's this sled from Rosebud, or Hermione's wand, or a lightsaber, or a coffee mug, or what have you. Props often reoccur as visual motifs that might give meaning throughout the film. And the sled from Citizen Kane is one such example, because the sled has a lot of emotional meaning for the protagonist of the film. Acting, costume, makeup, also very important elements of mise en scène. The Nutty Professor movies back in the 90s with Eddie Murphy were very elaborate in their makeup, because Eddie was putting on like a fat suit and putting all of this prosthetic makeup on his face, right? So he could play these different characters. He did the same thing in the Coming to America movies, just kind of part of his act, right? And this stuff is very, very sophisticated and elaborate. So we're not going to go too much into acting. Acting really is its own course or multiple courses, and there's so much you can learn. But we will talk for a couple of minutes about acting, because it's important, right? It's one of the most important elements of contemporary movies and television. We don't watch too much that doesn't feature actors, right? Even if we're watching an animated film, it's actors that are giving those animated characters their life, right? Through their voices. So, like mise en scène, early cinema was influenced by acting on the stage. And if you look at early movies and you wonder why the gestures are so sort of demonstrative, right? And it doesn't seem realistic according to our standards, it's because they were used to acting on the stage and playing to the back row, right? They didn't really understand what a close-up was yet, that you could emote with your face very subtly. But over the years, as cinema became its own art, the nature of film acting evolved apart from the nature of stage acting, right? And actors learned how to convey effective performances through the camera. One famous style of acting is called method acting. One of the most influential acting styles in movies was based on a psychological realism of Russian theater director Konstantin Stanislavski. And in the States, it was adapted by the actor and teacher Lee Strasberg. And some of the most formative and famous actors of American movies, post-classical Hollywood, starting in the 1950s, were method actors like Marlon Brando and Robert De Niro and Al Pacino, Dustin Hoffman. All these guys had their fingerprints all over American movies because their acting was seen as so intense and realistic, and it was very well suited to the cinema and the kinds of stories that were being told that were more realistic and sort of grittier, right? Daniel Day-Lewis, another famous method actor. And what method actors do is they connect their feelings of their character with their own experiences to create the performances. They try to live the life of their character when the cameras aren't rolling. They try to become that character psychologically, at least for a portion of time. And that might mean gaining weight for a role or learning how to do something. So, for example, one of the most famous method performances of all time was Robert De Niro in Raging Bull. He became such a good fighter that he was able to actually box professionally. And he also, for later scenes in the film, he famously gained a ton of weight. And people were kind of blown away by his commitment to playing this character so realistically. Brando was another famous method actor, and James Dean. So these guys have sort of cast a long shadow over contemporary movies, especially American movies. So what about stars? Well, stars are actors, right? But they're known for more than just acting. They're known for their star image, a persona, a presence, right? A celebrity that's sort of apart from the character they're playing. John Wayne, Will Smith, for sort of famous examples. Like, yes, they're acting. Yes, they're playing roles, but they're always sort of a version of themselves, right? And we're drawn to them, and we're drawn to those performances because we are drawn to the charisma of the actors. Of course, there are different kinds of roles, aside from stars and lead roles, character actors that play supporting parts, such as Jennifer Coolidge here, extras, or background performers, as they're now known, that appear briefly in films, right, without lines. If you live here in LA, you can sign up to be an extra. I mean, there's just so much production going on that a lot of people, as long as they're willing to wait in line or whatever overnight, can get a gig in the background. And then cameos, brief appearances in films by well-known actors, right? We all know when a star shows up just for a second in a movie. Okay, so that's acting. What about costume? Well, costumes are pretty straightforward. I think we all know what they are. We've probably all worn them ourselves, especially in this era of cosplay that's become so incredibly popular. They have specific functions, right? They can be very authentic, quote unquote, like Tom Hanks' uniform in Saving Private Ryan here. Not meant to call attention to itself. It's meant to just blend in and to the background and sort of help create this environment of the war. Or it can be more stylized in a movie like Marie Antoinette, Sofia Coppola's film, right? Where Coppola is trying to foreground elements of mise en scène to really convey the sort of grandeur and glamour of Marie Antoinette's life. And then a superhero costume, right, like in Blade, often very stylized. Here he is, sort of flowing capes and the leather, right, and the sunglasses, everything. What about makeup? Well, there's naturalistic makeup. I talked about they put makeup on me in Jeopardy. It wasn't so that I would look like the Joker, right? It was so that I would seem natural on camera. So an example would be Foxcatcher, where Steve Carell plays a character, and he's kind of trying to disappear into the character. And so he gets prosthetic makeup for a nose to make him look more like the character he's playing. This naturalist makeup functions unobtrusively to create resemblance to a real person and support performance. And not always have to be a real person. Of course, there can be fictional characters too, but the idea is that they're supposed to sort of look realistic, right? As opposed to more stylized makeup, right? Which is very exaggerated. So in this case, speaking of the Joker, highly stylized, exaggerated costume and makeup characterizes Nicholson's Joker as being very theatrical, right? He's a stage clown in this version of the Joker. He sort of prances around in the '89 Batman, right, with all these flourishes. Whereas the more muted approach characterized Heath Ledger's Joker as more realistic, because Christopher Nolan with The Dark Knight is going for a more realistic idea of Batman, right? The idea that Batman could exist in our own reality. If he could, this is what it would be like. It would be grittier, right? The colors would be more muted. Whereas Tim Burton in the '89 Batman is taking off on different influences, such as German Expressionism, right? He really admires Gothic architecture and art. And so very, very different stylizations to represent the same character. In recent decades, the craft of makeup has developed in response to the popularity of horror and science fiction. So around 1980, you'll see a massive change in horror films. You'll see a lot of sci-fi horror films with really grotesque imagery, like The Thing, John Carpenter's remake of the 50s movie. And we can see this all the way through to today with The Walking Dead, right? Makeup has become so sophisticated, and they've become so good at applying it that essentially you can have a show like The Walking Dead at an affordable price and have hundreds of extras walking around in this really elaborate makeup because they've gotten so good. The artists and craftspeople have gotten so good at applying it. Okay, let's finish up our lecture with a brief discussion about this idea of realism versus verisimilitude, your big word for the week. Verisimilitude is basically the appearance of being true or real. And that's what fiction is going for, right? Fiction is not documentary. It's not trying to be quote unquote real. It's just trying to make you feel like this world could be real. Now, viewers often judge Mise en scène by standards of realism, but notions of realism vary across eras and cultures and genres. So, for example, our idea of realism in a science fiction movie or in a fantasy film like The Lord of the Rings is much different than it would be in a war movie based on a real war, like Saving Private Ryan, for example. So, instead of looking at how realistic mise en scène seems, it's better to judge it by its function. How is it being used? And what is it trying to convey in the narrative? So a famous early example is German Expressionist cinema. We talked about how Tim Burton was influenced by German Expressionist cinema in his Batman movie, and all of his films, really. Especially if you look at a movie like Edward Scissorhands, for example. So in this frame from The Cabinet of the Dr. Caligari, this depiction of the rooftops does not accord with our conception of what we would call normal reality, right? Yet to condone the film for lacking realism would be appropriate because the film uses stylization of the settings to present a madman's fantasy. So in other words, it's supposed to convey a distorted point of view. So we don't look at this as viewers and say, oh, that doesn't seem realistic. That's ridiculous, right? And then reject the story. No, we say, okay, this is an artistic expression using mise en scène to convey an idea of what this guy sees, right? His view of the world. And so that's how we want to think about ideas of realism and of mise en scène, both as viewers and also as creators. Okay, so that is the end of the lecture. Move on and watch part 2 on lighting.